Thanks very much. I've got a little feedback there. Thank you for that whole introduction. I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'm sorry I have to stand over here in the corner, but I'm a philosopher, so I need a podium. I'd like to thank Marco and Roland and Angel and everybody who's been involved with this event for having me here. I've been through Nebraska many times. This is the first time that I've been here for several nights and stopped and had a chance to really see the place, and I like it a good deal. So my talk tonight is called Post-Truth in the Internet Age. In 2006, I published a book called Dark Ages, in which I argued that we needed to have a science of human behavior. It seemed to me that a lot of the ills that we had in society, war, crime, poverty, stemmed from a lack of understanding of the root causes of human action. And I thought that if we only had a more precise understanding of ourselves on par with the way that we understood nature, maybe we'd be in better shape. And the route to get us there seemed to be obvious. I thought that we needed the kind of respect for facts, truth, and evidence that existed in the natural sciences. So I wanted to make the social sciences more like the natural sciences. Well, then a funny thing happened, because by the time I looked up, the world had changed. Science, and by that I mean natural science, was under attack. People were not only refusing to engage in empirical inquiry on some scientific questions, they were refusing to believe certain scientific truths, even when the evidence was right in front of their faces. On topics like evolution by natural selection, climate change, vaccines, many people felt free to challenge the conclusions of hard-won scientific experiment with nothing more than mere opinion or ideology. If they didn't like a scientific result, they just felt completely free to substitute their own ill-informed judgment for that of experts. So I decided to write another book. In late 2015, before the presidential race was really underway, I published the book that you referred to earlier called Respecting Truth, Willful Ignorance in the Internet Age, which is about the problem of how it happens that society has arrived at a place where lies and obfuscation about scientific matters often win the day. And I asked in the book, is it because we don't understand science? Is it because of political ideology? The answer I discovered is that there's a slippery slope that leads from outright ignorance to something that I call willful ignorance, straight to outright denialism. And so I happily went out on the road to give a number of talks about the evils of science denial on matters like climate change, and I watched in horror as the presidential race kept getting uglier. And then damned if the world didn't change again. A number of the tactics of science denial had now metastasized into a much more widespread lack of respect for facts and truth in general. So my conclusions in the book, I felt, were still relevant. It's just that they now applied not just to scientific topics, but to a whole range of factual matters. But I really, at that point, felt like this couldn't last much longer and that the forces of denialism had encroached far enough and they'd surely be beaten back over time. And then came election night 2016. So we now find ourselves in what some have called the post-truth era. If Trump doesn't like the fact that he lost the popular vote, he simply makes up a story about how millions of illegal immigrants voted in California and other states. He doesn't like the photos that show a lot of empty seats at his inauguration. He simply sends his press secretary out to lie and say that his inauguration had the greatest attendance in US history. And the political price for this seems to be nil. I mean, people notice it, but what political price has he paid for that? So even if he believes that those things are true, we've got another question, which is how do you explain the millions of Americans who seem perfectly willing to buy this, perfectly willing not to make and pay any political price? It leads to the question, do facts matter anymore? Is there no price for spreading lies, disinformation? And make no mistake, I think that's what the phenomena of post-truth is really about. When the Oxford Dictionaries designated post-truth its 2016 word of the year, by the way, they did that before the election, they gave the following definition. Quote, post-truth is an adjective defined as relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief, end quote. So they're not really denying that facts exist, they're just saying they don't have the role that they might have. So there you have it. I think that the science deniers have won. When confronted with facts one doesn't like, people can just make up their own. Not only do people now feel free to deny climate change or evolution, they also feel at liberty to make up anything that they want about crowd size, election fraud, or any other factual matter. What matters now seems to be not whether something is true, but whether it feels true. And here I'm taking a page from Stephen Colbert, who hates the word post-truth, by the way, because he said it ripped him off, because a few years earlier he had coined the word truthiness to designate something that had the quality of, quote, seeming to be, or being felt to be true, even if not necessarily true, end quote. So that's a great joke, but people aren't laughing anymore. In the run-up to the election, you're supposed to laugh at that. In the run-up to the election, Trump said that the national murder rate was the highest it had ever been in the last 45 years. In fact, according to the Uniform Crime Report that's annually conducted by the FBI, it's at a 57-year low. Now, murder is easy to track. It's always reported, and there's usually some evidence, like a body. So the FBI statistics are going to be pretty good on murder. When confronted with this, Trump's advisors said that there were a lot of people in Chicago who would agree that Trump was right. And one of those people was Newt Gingrich, who had the following on-air exchange with CNN commentator Alison Camerata, which is on page 3 of the book, and I can't help, I want to read this to you. Camerata, violent crime is down, the economy is ticking up. Gingrich, it's not down in the biggest cities. Camerata, violent crime, murder rate, it is down. Gingrich, then how come it's up in Chicago and up in Baltimore and up in Washington? Camerata, there are pockets where certainly we're not tackling murder. Gingrich, your national capital, your third biggest city. Camerata, the violent crime across the country is down. Gingrich, the average American, I'll bet you this morning, doesn't think crime is down, doesn't think we're safer. Camerata, but it is. We are safer, and it is down. Gingrich, no, that's just your view. Now she gets pissed. Camerata, it's a fact. These are national FBI facts. Gingrich, but what I said is also a fact. The current view is that liberals have a whole set of statistics that theoretically may be right, but it's not where human beings are. Camerata, okay, but what you're saying, but hold on, Mr. Speaker, because you're saying liberals use these numbers. They use this sort of magic math. These are FBI statistics. They're not a liberal organization. They're a crime-fighting organization. Gingrich, no, but what I said is equally true. People feel more threatened. Camerata, feel it, yes, they feel it, but the facts don't support it. Gingrich, as a political candidate, I'll go with how people feel and let you go with the theoreticians. Now, Gingrich's a very smart guy, and he probably knows that what he said is wrong, but that's post-truth. Because post-truth is about the political dominance of reality. It's not simply about lying, it's about lying to the effect of trying to dominate someone in a political way. So I could go on here and talk a little bit more about Kellyanne Conway's coining of the term alternative facts, or we already referred to Rudy Giuliani's declaration that truth isn't truth, or the bastardization of the word fake news. But what I'm going to do instead is talk a little bit about where I think that post-truth came from, because I think that if you've been paying attention in this country for the last 18 months, you know all those quotations, you know all of the outrage, and you've watched this kind of spin toward this. I mean, sales of 1984 are way up. I brought my childhood copy of 1984, just, you know, as a talisman tonight. This is an important book these days. So, and you might have noticed if you've read Post-Truth that I start almost every chapter with a quotation from Orwell. So instead, what I want to talk about a bit tonight is the surprisingly deep roots of post-truth, because I don't think that this phenomenon just sprang up overnight, but instead I think it's the inevitable result of several precipitating forces that have been eroding respect for truth for several decades now. And I think that if we can understand these forces, which began to gather momentum in the tobacco lobby's efforts in the 1950s to obfuscate the question of whether cigarettes cause cancer, and then took a quick hop to muddying the waters over global warming in the 2000s, we're going to see that the same forces that were at work in science denial have now simply engulfed all of empirical reality. It's just an enlargement of the tactics of science denial. By looking back a bit, I think that we can understand not only where post-truth came from, but how to fight back. Trump's presidency may seem inexplicably tied up with post-truth, but it's well to remember something. Trump's election was not the sudden cause of disrespecting truth. It was the result. The first causal force behind post-truth is also the oldest, for it's been with us since the beginning of our species, and that's cognitive bias. I don't know how many of you might have read Daniel Kahneman's wonderful book, Thinking Fast and Slow. It's a terrific book about all of the wired-in shortcuts that the human mind has, such as confirmation bias, which can feel a lot like thinking. I mean, you want to believe something, you go out and you find evidence that it's true. It feels like thinking, but it's really not thinking. Instead, you should go out and look for evidence to challenge your presuppositions to see whether they're actually true. And these days, we don't have to look very far for confirmation bias, do we? Because there are entire television networks and websites and online communities that are built around telling us exactly what we want to hear. When this is the primary place that we get our news, we may find ourselves in an information silo, where we're cut off from gaining the perspective that might help us to challenge our views. And this doesn't just happen on the right. Those of you who are liberals, I challenge you to go back and watch some of the breathless coverage of the 2016 presidential campaign on MSNBC, knowing how it all turned out, and tell me that they couldn't have devoted a few hours to alienated Rust Belt voters who ultimately first voted for Obama and then voted for Trump. They were out there, but I didn't hear any stories about them on MSNBC. There are tons of other cognitive biases out there as well. One of the most interesting was discovered by Brendan Nyhan, who's a political scientist from Dartmouth College, which is called the backfire effect. You might have heard of this. Nyhan found through hard-nosed experimental analysis that when you present people with demonstrable evidence that what they believe is not true, instead of eroding their belief, it will harden it. They will double down. So how do you ever convince anybody of anything? Which is a couple of articles on that. It's hard. Another of my favorite cognitive biases, this one won an Ig Nobel Prize, but it's actually a very important result. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is popularly known as the too stupid to know they're stupid effect, which shows that people who are misinformed are harder to convince than people who are merely uninformed. Okay? I mean, Socrates knew this a long time ago. It's false knowledge is a bigger danger than ignorance. But now there's experimental evidence that Socrates was right. These sorts of cognitive biases are magnified by a second contributing force to post-truth, which is the rise of social media. That story can't be told, of course, without first acknowledging the decline of traditional media. As cable TV inaugurated the 24-hour news cycle in the 1980s, news outlets found themselves with many more hours to fill. And that led to the growth of opinion-based media and the rise of all these pundits instead of investigative journalists who began to report the news with a slant. This proved to be very popular, and soon there were entire TV networks that were created to reflect different political points of view. With questions of bias now front and center, that caused many in the traditional news media to blanch, and they were at great pains to distinguish themselves through even what they thought of as even greater objectivity, which unfortunately they showed by a reflex to, quote, tell both sides of the story, end quote, even when there really weren't two sides, like whether there's a scientific controversy on climate change. You look back at some of the coverage on whether vaccines cause autism or whether climate change is real, and you'll see split-screen debates, you know, somebody from the National Academy of Science and somebody who's not on the other side of the screen arguing, and then the host saying, it's controversial, you decide. This creates, which is not journalism. Journalism is not supposed to do that. It's not, somebody once said, journalism isn't supposed to put on somebody who says it's raining, somebody who says it's not. They're supposed to look out the window and see which one is right. So this creates the problem of false equivalence, which we've actually seen on the news a little bit in the last couple of days. Suddenly, rather than telling the truth, news outlets were sometimes obfuscating it by refusing to take sides, which plays right into the hands of those who are seeking to create confusion over factual matters like climate change through bogus skepticism. Alongside that came the rise of the internet as a source of news, which further blurred the line between objective news sources and partisan ones. With blogs, tweets, and other social media, people could suddenly feed their desire for confirmation bias and free news without bothering to patronize traditional news sources. And admit it, some of you didn't buy that subscription to the Washington Post or New York Times. You go for the free articles. Ad revenues and subscribers fell along with viewership and circulation until it's now reached a point where, according to a recent Pew poll, 62% of Americans get their news not from traditional news outlets, but from news aggregators on the internet. And that always to me seemed a little ironic because the internet is really a wonderful thing because it allows immediate access to reliable information by anyone who wants to look for it. But it can also be an echo chamber. And that's dangerous because if there's no form of editorial control, including us being skeptical, sometimes there can be news that comes to us that's really not true, which is fake news. So here I can tell a story. So when I was a little boy, I was an inquisitive guy, which is maybe why I went into philosophy. But I remember one time I was standing at the local Albertsons with my mom, and there was the National Enquirer, and it had some scandalous headline. I forget what it was, but this was, they've been around a long time, scandals, perennial. And I remember saying, wow, Mom, look at that. And she said, don't believe that, it's all lies. And I said, how do you know it's a lie? You haven't even picked it up and read it. And she said, it's the National Enquirer, I know that they lie. I said, how do you know that? And so we had a real argument right through the checkout line. And I became a philosopher, what can I tell you, right? Fast forward to our present situation. I was just home in Portland, Oregon, and I saw the National Enquirer right where it always used to be. And I thought of a thought experiment. What if you bought the paper copy of the National Enquirer and you bought a paper copy of the New York Times, and you took it home, and you cut out the stories, and then you scanned them and electronically changed the font so that you couldn't tell which was from which, and you took the names off? Could you tell, just at glancing at them, which was a reliable source and which was not? I'm not sure that you could. Maybe if you read it and if you're careful. But the point is, that's exactly how our news comes to us now. How do you know whether a news source is reliable? How quickly do you decide? There are all of these new news sources, the famous ones, Breitbart, Newsmax, InfoWars, Vox, Occupy Democrats. Which of those are reliable, which not? How about abcnews.com.co? That's not abcnews.com, mind you. That's abcnews.com.co, which is not affiliated with ABC News. That's all I'll say about that. With the presentation of traditionally vetted news sources right alongside lies and propaganda, which in some cases has been cleverly disguised to look as respectable as possible, how can you be expected to know what's true and what's not anymore? So now our daily news gathering information routines have to be constantly interrupted by weeding out fake news. But we have to do it because the stakes for this are incredibly high. Fake news is not simply news that's false. Fake news is news that is deliberately false. A fake news has been created for a purpose. At first, the purpose is maybe clickbait. They want you to click on that provocative headline so that they can get a few more pennies in their coffers. Much in the same way that the National Enquirer would run stories like, Hillary, 6 months to live. I mean, you gotta buy that one, right? You gotta see how that one comes out. I think they were wrong. But then the darkness descended because some of the creators of fake news began to notice that the favorable stories about Trump were getting 10 times the number of clicks as the favorable stories about Hillary, and that the negative stories about Hillary were getting hundreds more clicks. So guess which ones they doubled down on? In this environment, fake news evolved from clickbait to propaganda, and its new purpose was to offer biased content for the purpose not of financial gain, not merely, but of political manipulation. Fake news is a deliberate attempt to get someone to change their mind and actions based on the dissemination of a falsehood. And you've all heard them. Hillary was busing in protesters. Hillary had a brain tumor. Hillary was running a child sex ring out of a pizza shop. You heard about that when the guy actually showed up at the pizza shop with a shotgun. He was so angry. People believed this stuff, and the consequences, in fact, one time came close to starting a nuclear war. And you probably don't remember that because it was just after the election and there wasn't a lot of it on American media. But just after the 2016 US presidential election, Pakistan threatened a nuclear confrontation with Israel based on an alleged threat that Israel had just made, except that the original threat had come from a fake news story. So they had the defense minister of Pakistan saying that he was going to annihilate Israel based on what they just threatened to do, but they never threatened to do it. Catastrophic, potentially. Finally, we have to discuss what I regard as one of the saddest roots of post-truth, because it hits closest to home, and I got to think especially in this room, colleges and universities. Because many of you have known, many of you may already know the long and contentious debate over relativism and postmodernism as it pertains to our beliefs about race, class, and gender. Relativism and postmodernism grew out of literary criticism in the 1980s and asked questions like, is there any such thing as objective truth? Is any profession of truth nothing more than a bullying tactic by the powerful to exploit those who are powerless? Well, this all came to a head in something called the Science Wars of the 1990s, which consisted of a battle between some faculty members from the humanities and from the natural sciences over whether even science itself could make a claim to objective truth. The argument here was that by positioning themselves as experts, natural scientists were merely advancing their own agenda of power and exploitation against the poor and disenfranchised. Science's claim to make a fact-value distinction was severely taken to task with the idea that there was no truth that could be put forward about the natural world. There wasn't also a reflection of the political values of the scientists who had discovered it. Now, that battle is still going on to some extent, but over the last few years, a very interesting thing has happened. Because a lot of the folks who were attacking science have realized, oh no, our tools have now been picked up by the right, and they're using it to attack climate change. And we really, really didn't mean that. And this has caused a kind of a discombobulation on the left. And I'm now here, and I didn't plan the New York Times story to come out today, but here it is, a quotation from Bruno Latour, one of the founders of the science studies movement, who is not a philosopher of science, I think. He recently had this to say by way of an attempt at reparations. Quote, so this is Latour speaking. Entire PhD programs are still running to make sure that good American kids are learning the hard way that facts are made up, that there's no such thing as natural, unmediated, unbiased access to language, to truth, that we're always prisoners of language, that we always speak from a particular standpoint, and so on. While dangerous extremists are using the very same arguments of social construction to destroy hard-won evidence that could save lives. Was I wrong to participate in the invention of this field known as science studies? Is it enough to say that we do not really mean what we said? Why does it burn my tongue to see that global warming is a fact, whether you like it or not? Why can't I simply say that the argument is closed for good? You don't find more of a full mea culpa than that in academia. I think that's the price you pay for playing with ideas as if they had no consequences, imagining that they'll be used only for the political purposes that one intended. Instead, the entire edifice of science, and maybe reality, is now under attack in a way that might well threaten the most vulnerable, the poor and disenfranchised, who are probably going to bear the brunt of the effects from climate change. And unfortunately, as we've seen, what started in science denial has now morphed into truth denial and reality denial in general. What began as playing around with the concept of objective truth has now backfired with potentially catastrophic consequences. And I myself am a political liberal, as you might have guessed, but I nonetheless recognize the bite of George Orwell, another famous liberal, who said, quote, so much of left-wing thought is a kind of playing with fire by people who don't even know that fire is hot, end quote. So that article in the New York Times is there today where Latour is now apparently saying, no, if they just read a little closer, they would have found that we were really defending science. That really, and scientists should read our work, by the way, because then they'll learn better how they can defend science. Read it for yourself. He's backed off a little bit on the mea culpa. Now he wants to prove that he had been right all along. He was just misinterpreted. Okay, so now that we've discovered the roots of post-truth and seen that there's more than enough blame to go around, what can we do about it? How should those of us who believe in the importance of facts and truth fight back? One of the most important weapons in our arsenal is simply to challenge those who are lying. The price of intellectual freedom is eternal vigilance. Some liars are probably too far gone, and we won't be able to change their minds. But it's important to remember where post-truth started. By definition, every lie has an audience. There are those who are lying, and there are those who are lied to. And if you don't confront a liar, well, the people who haven't yet moved from ignorance to willful ignorance to denial really have any reason to doubt what the liar is telling them. I mean, if you leave the field and you say, well, that's not worthy of a response, the people who are hearing the lie might end up believing it. At the very least, we have to witness and call out each and every attempt to obfuscate and spread falsehoods before it can infect other people. And here again, I think it's important to look back at the early fight against science deniers, because that's what we've been doing for a while now. I write on science denial a good deal. Science deniers and people who want to deny reality may have a strong voice, but it's a powerful thing to have the truth on your side. History shows that only for so long can the truth be covered up. Eventually, even smokers had to come to understand that smoking caused lung cancer, despite the fact that tobacco companies covered it up for 50 years. After a measles outbreak in 14 states a while back, the media stopped telling both sides of the story about Andrew Wakefield's false and fraudulent work on vaccines and autism. By the way, that work was not just suspect, it was fraud. They proved that Wakefield had a competing interest, it had an interest in a competing vaccine, and that it was the lawyer who was representing him in that helped him find some people in the study that he did. So it was fraud. It was not just false. But look at the heartache. People who have children with autism love their children. They don't believe this because they don't, the vaccines are causing autism because they don't love their children. They believe it because they were misled by a fraudster. Eventually, though, people do, when confronted with facts, change their minds. And there's something I read not long ago in a local newspaper in Florida about a man named James Kaysen, who was the mayor of Coral Gables, Florida, who a few days, he's a Rochford Republican mayor, and a few days after he became mayor, he changed his mind about climate change. And he said this, quote, "You know, I've read some articles here and there, but I didn't realize how impactful it would be in the city I'm now the leader of." Well, all of a sudden. And you know what the problem was? And I've got to read this. The problem was that there were a number of houses in Coral Gables had yachts, and if the yachts need to get out underneath the bridge, and if the water level rises, they can't get out from under the bridge. There are apparently 302 such yachts. Quote, "These are $5 million homes with nice boats, but suddenly see their property values going down because they can no longer get their boat out." Well, that will all of a sudden make you believe in climate change, I guess. Okay, so there's another thing that we have to do to fight back against post-truth, though, and I think that we have to get ready for things to get worse. And I wish I could end on an optimistic note, but I'm not going to. Instead, I'm going to scare the hell out of you with what I think is the coming wave of fake news. This was not part of what I used to talk about, but I've discovered recently that there is a storm coming of fake news that you are not going to believe, and I'm going to show you some of the precursors of it, the technological precursors tonight. Instead of simple text or picture-based content, you know, people Photoshop, they can put anything in text that they want. We don't know whether it's true or not. The latest development on the horizon involves what are called deepfakes, which are manipulated audio and video content so realistic and fast emerging that I predict that within the next 2 years, we won't even be able to tell with the naked eye or ear what's genuine or what's fake. Think of the Access Hollywood tape. You heard it with your own ears. But what happens when you can't trust that? Remember not so long ago, Mitt Romney making the statement about the 47% who never vote for him because of smuggled in audio tape? What if everybody thought that was fake? Now, eventually Trump did say that the Access Hollywood tape was fake, but nobody really believed him. But would they believe him if they had to contend with things like this? This is from a company called Lyrebird.
On the right, we can see the final output of our method. Our system reconstructs and tracks both source and target actors using a dense photometric energy minimization. So the rest of the video, it's a 6-minute video, the rest of it is text. I loved watching your faces. Why was I smiling during that? I was wrecking your world, right? Can you believe that they're able to do that? That's real-time manipulation. That's not just Photoshop. That's having somebody stand off to the side with a mask, face capture, where they can make the person on the screen say anything they want and give any facial expression that they want. And here's the moment where I'm supposed to, show there's a guy off there talking and I'm really I can't do that. But I mean, how long will it be before they're able to manipulate both audio and video so that you can't tell the difference? So you now begin to appreciate the enormity of our challenge, because the problem with fake news isn't just that it manipulates us into thinking that fake content is real. It also tempts us to think that real content is fake. Trump has already appropriated the term fake news for his own political purposes, right? I mean, fake news used to mean just what we thought it meant, that people would fake something, put it forward, and try to get us to believe that it's true. Trump's definition seems to be any negative stories about him. That's really the way that he uses the term. So far we fought this with fact checkers, but what happens when the audio and video resources no longer allow for the kind of fact checking that we're used to? Because the mere existence of deepfake technology bolsters the conspiracy theorist claim that everything is fake. I mean, imagine a world in which you showed them video proof of something and they say, oh, that's just got to be fake. How do you know? Because everything is fake. Does truth exist if we can't defend it? Without the will to fight back or the tools to do so, might we have already entered a post-truth era, not because no one cares, but because we live in an age when liars are no longer held accountable, because we can't find a way to hold them accountable. We can't prove it. The interplay between political ideology, technology, and cognitive bias is an especially dangerous one. And I want to end here tonight with a passage from someone who I've already mentioned a couple of times, George Orwell, whose book 1984 was eerily prescient in anticipating our present situation. If you're a fan of the book, you might remember the scene. Winston Smith works at the Ministry of Truth. Right? The Ministry of Truth is where they lie to you. Its job is every day is to create the cascade of lies that serve the interest of the party. And one day he accidentally discovers photographic proof that the party has been lying. He holds in his hand a piece of paper which is proof. It officially contradicts the party propaganda. Knowing full well that he's being watched by the telescreen, he's suddenly paralyzed with fear. And I'll end with Orwell's passage. To keep your face expressionless was not difficult, and even your breathing could be controlled with an effort, but you could not control the beating of your heart, and the telescreen was quite delicate enough to pick it up. Winston let what he judged to be 10 minutes go by, tormented all the while by the fear that some accident, a sudden draft blowing across his desk, for instance, would betray him. Then, without uncovering it again, he dropped the photograph into the memory hole, along with some other waste paper. Within another minute, it would have crumbled into ashes. That was 10 years ago. Today, probably he would have kept that photograph. It was curious that the fact of having held it in his fingers seemed to make a difference to him even now, when the photograph itself, as well as the events it recorded, was only a memory. Was the party's hold upon the past less strong, he wondered, because a piece of evidence which existed no longer had once existed? The immediate advantages of falsifying the past were obvious.
but the ultimate motive was mysterious. He took up his pen again and wrote, "I understand how, I do not understand why." He wondered, as he had many times wondered before, whether he himself was a lunatic. That's it. I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. You want to field them for me? Because
we have 2 minutes for questions.
I don't mind calling on people that you may have people that you know should be called on. So I don't want to step on any toes here.
We're going to give them a shout out. Why did you get it? Communication 189, you're getting a shout out.
Okay. Yes. I brought you all down at the end. I know.
I was already down, I can tell you that.
Okay.
So it strikes me that we have lots and lots of examples of fake news throughout history being used specifically as propaganda. And Nazism and Stalinism stand out to me as examples. With neo-fascists existing in the world today, is there any hope for examples being used to show people how they're being misled?
I'm going to answer the first part of the question there, which I thought you were going to ask first, just to make sure. Because post-truth is the word that we now use for this concept of what's happening now. Lying for political purposes has been around for an awfully long time. I think that the thing that makes post-truth, makes it a modern phenomenon, is the idea that it's not just spin and it's not just propaganda. It's propaganda with the purpose of political dominance. Now Jason Stanley, who's written about fascism, will say that that's all propaganda. Propaganda is not meant to convince you, propaganda is meant to rule you, right? Why does somebody lie? Masha Gessen, the Russian dissident, would say the same thing. Why do Putin and Trump lie when they know that they can be contradicted by something that's on videotape? They do it to assert dominance. So that's really what post-truth, I think, is about. Now, the last part of your question was, are there any examples to give us hope? I think keep fighting it. I mean, this was the most optimistic thing that I found in researching the book, and it's in the book which I wrote about, was that there are social psychologists who write on this topic of how do you convince somebody, right? Because if the backfire effect is real and presenting people with facts causes them to double down on falsehood, then why even talk to anybody about anything, and how do you ever get through that? But the point with the guy with the boats in Coral Gables is that people do eventually change their mind. Because they do change their mind when they're confronted with facts over and over again in the right context. Now they found that it helps not to yell at people. It helps not to call them names. I mean, they really experimentally, they found this. Graphs help rather than text. And so, not being able to get your vote out, very persuasive, right? But I mean, you can't, there are articles on this which have found empirically that if you present people with the facts over and over and over again, hit them right between the eyes with the facts, they will eventually change their mind. Now, I'm going to test this myself. Because in November, this is not a speaking engagement, it's just a conference that I'm going to. I'm going to the Flat Earth Convention in Denver. And as a philosopher, not incognito, I'm not going to wear any funny t-shirts. I'm just going to go and I'm going to talk to them about the reasoning strategy. I'm not going to bring a plumb bob. I'm not going to do any physics for them, because it's kind of an insult, right? I mean, the evidence has been there for 500 years. So if they were going to believe it, they believe it. Instead, I'm going to talk to them about warrant, justification. You know, why do you have the highest standards of proof for the thing that you want to believe, but this other thing, you're completely gullible about, you don't need any evidence whatsoever. Because, you know, that's how conspiracy theories work. So I'm going to take them seriously, I'm going to be nice, friendly, because I really want to understand how I'm writing a new book called How to Talk to a Science Denier. And I'm going to visit anthracite coal miners in Pennsylvania. I'm going to go to the Flat Earth Convention. I'm going to the Maldives to see what climate change really looks like. And have a nice vacation.
right? I'm going to do all of this research to try to find out, because that's one thing that people say to you, have you seen it? You know, flat earthers claim that Australia isn't real. Have you been there? On the trip out to Lincoln, I spoke with an airline pilot who said, I asked him, is there anything that you can do? That part of the conspiracy is that supposed to be that the airline pilots are all in on it. They know that the Earth is flat. He said, I hate to tell you, but you can't see the curvature of the Earth until you get to 80,000 feet. But he was a military pilot, and he said he knew people who had done it. So, you know, first-hand evidence counts for a lot. So, yeah, hit people between the eyes with the facts and don't give up. Don't just let the liars have the field.
So, I'm curious about any kind of correlation between funding for higher education and the kind of post-truth or propaganda that you're talking about here. So, for example, going and doing some research and presenting the facts that are already there, and just letting them come to themselves. When you have a state like Nebraska or Kansas or any other place where you're just cutting funding for higher education, or maybe cutting funding for any kind of research projects that might be on the horizon.
Right.
That seems like the sort of thing that centralized government can very easily do in order to continue their.
I mean, it's a problem. It's not an insurmountable problem, but it's terrible. I mean, they won't even, the federal government will not fund any studies on guns and violence. They will not allow it. When the job before I was at the Institute for Quantitative Social Science at Harvard, I worked with one of the deans who was responsible for the funding and lab space and such at Harvard. And at that time there was a ban on stem cell research. And so so we couldn't use any federal money for it, but we could use private money. But that meant that every piece of equipment in that lab had to be privately funded, and so they had to go through a kind of a dual inventory. It was a real pain. We had to oversee. I was the compliance officer for this, and we had to oversee all of how they did that. And it was hard, but it was possible. So the truth has a funny way of wending its way out. It'll take a while. Look at what happened with smoking and lung cancer. In the 1950s, there was a consensus that smoking caused lung cancer, and the scientists were just about to release the definitive finding. And the tobacco company executives went into a panic. They met at a hotel. They hired a public relations person to come in, and they decided on what's ever since been called the tobacco strategy, which you can find in Naomi Oreskes' book, Merchants of Doubt. She tells the whole story about how they came up with this strategy of fighting the science. They denied. They hired their own scientists. They took out full-page ads. They started the precursor to the American Tobacco Institute. And for the next 40 years, they created controversy where there was none. You ask anybody, was there controversy? Well, they have not. What was it? The causal link between cigarette smoking and lung cancer has not been definitively proven. Well, I hate to tell you, but if you study the problem of induction and statistics, the causal link between any two things has never been conclusively proven. But they rode that pony for 40 years while they were making profits. Finally got caught. The memos finally got leaked. By the way, the same thing happened with climate change people. They followed the tobacco strategy. The memos got leaked, I think, in a week when they did it, which revealed things like ExxonMobil, at the same time that they were denying that climate change was real, they also had another arm that was planning on exploiting new oil fields once the polar ice cap had melted. So, some duplicity there. Yeah.
I teach in the English department here, and one of the things that we've seen recently reminds me of your comment about false equivalence in journalism. So, we've had a kind of academic freedom crisis in the state of Nebraska, and one of the many tangents of that was some ideologically motivated political people looking up all the faculty in the English department and their voter registrations and determining that an insufficient number of us are registered as Republican. And the implication or the outright claim then is that we need to be actively recruiting or hiring people who are registered as Republican for what they're calling intellectual diversity. And of course, this is part of a larger national movement It's kind of like the relativism argument or other kinds of arguments that take the veneer of a liberal value, which is like diversity, but they weaponize it against human rights and basic kinds of tenets that we stand for in education. So the idea is that we're not supposed to be teaching truth. We're not supposed to be teaching from our expertise. We're supposed to be somehow bringing in and uplifting viewpoints based on political influence from the outside, as opposed to what's warranted by the teaching context.
Because the assumption there is that what you already believe is political in the first place, and so it needs to be balanced out by a political belief on the other side. Because what you're doing couldn't possibly be discovering truth. It has to be truth through your political lens. And if you believe that, right, if you think that all truth comes to you through your political beliefs, which is something that the postmodernism had started with, then that argument in the wrong hands can make you think, well, yes, but then don't you need it to be balanced out on the other side? I think the way to fight that, false equivalence, I think the way to fight that is simply to flag it as false equivalence, you know, to call it out. I've been watching the news for the last couple of days, seeing that there's a lot of both-siderism going on CNN right now. An awful lot of people are saying, yes, but didn't Maxine Waters say that if you saw somebody at a gas station, you should confront them? Well, okay, yes, but is that actually equivalent to the political terrorism of bombing? Now, again, they don't know who's done that yet. And there's all this talk about it being a false flag, which is, conspiracy theory. But the point is, if I can find a breadcrumb over here, that doesn't equal a loaf over here. And one thing that I see right away in my book at the beginning is, I'm not going to succumb to false equivalence. I'm going to talk, most of the examples of post-truth are examples from the right, and that's where it's going to come from. I don't know what to say about your present situation. Is the tape going to be played? Am I going to get out of town tomorrow before the tape is played? I don't know. Really, they wanted to say, because you're a public university, they wanted to withhold funding unless you did.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly if that specific threat was made, but the implication on right-wing radio and from a certain little group of politicians is that there needs to be, and somehow intellectual diversity is represented in political party registration.
If you were discriminating, okay, if you were looking through CVs and anybody who had particular political views or political religious views, and you were excluding them from your search, that's one thing. Yeah. That's so. If you were discriminating, and then the claim was you needed to have more diversity because you were discriminating, that's one thing. But absent evidence that you're actually discriminating, I'm not sure that works. Yes.
So I'm also in the English department, but I study really old things. I work in the 16th and 17th centuries, and in the period in which I study, and I'm specifically in Europe, although I'm aware of kind of more global trends, the word and the concept of the fact doesn't exist, right? I mean,
fact?
Fact.
Yeah.
The word does exist. It means something done, a deed, or something like that. It has none of the kind of ideological or the epistemological heft that we attribute to facts today. Truth does exist in the period, and everybody agrees that it is the truth of Christianity, which can be found in the Bible and the theology of the time. And so there's widespread agreement about that. And so from my perspective, looking at this historically and being aware of some of the science studies work that has been done historically, it seems to me like we can explain the fact that these things didn't exist in the time period in two ways. Either they were completely unaware of these things that existed in some objective sphere and they had just not discovered them yet, and we have. Right. Or you can say that these concepts are ones in which there is widespread social agreement, that there is a kind of social constructivism that goes on here, which isn't to say that they don't have very real effects in the world and on people's actions and on our interactions with the natural world.
You're right. I mean, I've read my Thomas Kuhn. I've taught Thomas Kuhn. I understand that it's your interpretation of the fact can depend on your point of view, what you expect to see. I get that. But even Kuhn, even most social studies of science, the social constructivist folks, will, I think, agree that there's such a thing as evidence. Now, evidence for belief, but then how do you interpret evidence from what point of view? But I think back to Galileo, if you want to go back a few years, I think back to Galileo. What was so amazing about what he did is that he had evidence, which was not unlike the evidence that Winston had in his hands, right? The church said, no, there couldn't possibly be satellites orbiting Jupiter. And he said, you want to look through my telescope and see? He had a way of settling the dispute. It was not ideological. Maybe they didn't call that fact. Maybe they didn't call it evidence. I mean, the word scientist didn't exist till the 19th century, though they had scientia way back when. But, I mean, that, but the concept was there. The concept, look, if it's an empirical question, look for yourself to see what the evidence is. Inform your beliefs based on what the evidence tells you.
But that in itself is a historical response, right? I mean, Galileo is one of the first that is promoting this, and his telescopes were so bad that everyone he sent that to looked through, and some said, yeah, I see it, and some said, no, I don't.
Yeah.
And it ended up kind of depending on their beliefs. I mean, part of I agree with you that there are standards of evidence, and the point being that what those standards of evidence are in terms of whether they're convincing or not is something that we agree on as a society. And it seems to me that it would be more productive to think about why we're disagreeing over those in our society right now and try to find some way to come back in agreement. It's not that standards of evidence or ideas about truth don't exist. They evolve over time. And we are in a moment where they have fallen apart. And I think that the scholars that were working in sociology and history and philosophy of science do in fact bear some responsibility for that unraveling at this particular moment. They were profoundly irresponsible in terms of thinking about the political ramification of their work. But it doesn't, I'm not sure you want to put that genie back in the bottle, because I actually think it would be helpful in thinking about how to move forward, because I'm not sure that just saying like facts are out there and you all are ignoring them, like as you've noted several times, it doesn't work.
And you're right, and here I am giving a public lecture on this, and I'm a philosopher, and I know that truth and facts, I mean, I can argue with the best of them with all the footnotes about the definition of what it means, all the arguments for and against interpretations that you're talking about. And you're right, because if it's part of cognitive bias, your brain helps you to see what you think you should see, visually, or textually. You will. I mean, the people who are science deniers, they're not saying, I'm a fact denier. They don't even self-identify as science deniers. They think they're right. They think they have the facts on their side. And maybe the thing that you're talking about is how philosophers of science and others who care about this issue can help people to understand what it means to have a good standard of evidence, what it means to actually justify. This is, in fact, the work that I'm hoping to do, to kind of meet people where they are at the Flat Earth Convention and see what kind of arguments are they using, and how can I help them to think of better arguments?
Did you know that the people in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance did not believe the Earth was flat? That's a modern thing. The ancient world knew the globe was round.
Yeah.
I think this also goes to even our daily diet, and I don't know if you also look at the sugar industry as well, because in the 1960s, the sugar industry actually funded research that downplayed the risks of sugar and highlighted the fat as a hazard. And so that's how non-fat became so popular and has continued to become popular, which has then created the epidemic of diabetes and other chronic diseases. And we're talking about Harvard here, because Harvard joined the sugar industry in the 1960s to promote this fallacy which then highlighted carbohydrates and sugar as deadly. And even today, we have an issue regarding people who have allergies, and so the non-gluten foods have become popular. And the sugar industry has entered that realm too, where they take out the gluten and put in sugar. So if you ever look at a package of anything that's non-gluten, you will see carbohydrate counts out the roof. And this is why people then are getting sick and sicker. And if we do this, if we continue to do this, we're going to have, again, this idea of, well, it's what I like. Because then the research also has shown that they have put rats in a cage. On one side heroin, on one side sugar. Where do the cats go? Or the rats go? They go to the sugar, they don't go to the heroin.
So, industry research, industry-funded research is so automatically suspect that scientists are expected to disclose where the funding is from. They have conflicts of interest because people know that if you're doing industry research which shows something and you're funded by that industry, it's going to be suspect. I haven't looked at that specific example, but I do know, if you read Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's book, Merchants of Doubt, some of the motivation behind this obfuscation has been financial. Look at the petroleum companies against climate change. Look at the cigarette companies against smoking and cancer. So maybe this is another example. I haven't studied this one. The trouble is, from my point of view, studying science deniers, is that what sometimes happens is that, that's pretty obvious. You catch somebody, oh, this is industry funded, you didn't disclose it. What happens is when that becomes ideological, because it starts out as industry funded, and then everybody knows, well, wink, wink, nod, nod, yeah, that's not true, because we're making a boatload of money on it. But then some people, they're not making a boatload of money, but they believe it anyway. And that's, I think, what's happened with climate change. It started off as this tobacco strategy pushback, because it wasn't that many years ago that Newt Gingrich and Nancy Pelosi were sitting on the couch talking about a solution to climate change. And then all of a sudden it became partisan. And it became partisan when the big industry money came in. And then it became ideological. So Upton Sinclair said, it's hard to get a man to believe something when his salary depends on him not believing it. Right? So the money really corrupts it. But then it takes off from there. Even after the money's taken out of the picture, people will believe things because they've heard it or they've seen it. I forget what the ad buy was for the tobacco industry, but if it wasn't, there weren't that many people in the United States back then. They didn't have to buy ads in that many newspapers to influence 40 million people to think, oh, really? They don't know whether cigarette smoking causes cancer? If you would be willing to, after the talk, give me something to read on this, I'd be interested. Because one chapter in my new book is going to be on GMOs. So I'm kind of interested in food, which is something that I've never studied. Yes, all the way in the back.
Okay, so I'm interested in understanding the post-truth. So let's say that we understand it, but it doesn't necessarily lead to a solution. And so the effects might still be lingering, even if we know about all the causal factors and all the cognitive trappings. And so here's a possible solution, and I don't think it will work, and I'll explain why. So let's say that we educate everyone, and we tell them about what's going on, what caused it, and all the cognitive stuff. There is a lot of things that are trying to counteract that. We have fake news, we have computational psychology, predictive analytics, social media with biased algorithms, so you're getting news feeds that are more or less personalized to you, to give you information that
you're going to like.
Right, exactly. And to make matters even worse, the technology is becoming more and more widely available. We could all go to sleep tonight, wake up tomorrow morning, go on Google, find out how to create, or download some scripts and some Python libraries, go online, make botnets, and go influence the world.
So what's your solution?
Yeah, so that leads to information deluge. right? So even if you're the most knowledgeable person about all this stuff, you're attacked by all of these companies and all of these factors. And so then the question is, can we do it on our own? And so I think, well, in order to fight against this stuff, we're going to need something stronger than just education. We need some kind of institutional initiative that's going to combat against all of this.
You got me on the edge of my seat. Like what though? I mean, look, Trump doesn't have a